Greetings, this is Bradford Donald Keller Townsend, and this is a forward research report from USNI, the United States Naval Institute. French ambassador says Washington could do more to help shape Syria's future by John Grady, October 30th, 2018. The Bashar al-Assad regime's ever-tightening circle on Syrian resistance fighters could send 1 million or more refugees into Turkey and scatter thousands of Islamic extremists around the region, France's ambassador to the United States warned Monday. Speaking at the Hudson Institute in Washington, District of Columbia, he added, France's President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met over the weekend in Istanbul to discuss the possible fallout as resistance crumbles in Idlib city province, Gerard Arad said. Someone was missing, he asked, referring to the United States. American news outlets also largely ignored the conference over how to deconflict military operations, handle the expected flow of refugees, and what to do about foreign fighters who would be fleeing the onslaught of ground forces from the regime and Iranian proxy militias backed by Russian airstrikes, he said. The Iranians and the Syrian regime and resistance groups also were not present. The broader aims of the Istanbul talks were to arrange a ceasefire and lay the groundwork for a peace process to begin that would include the return of refugees from Syria's neighbors and Europe. Russia and the regime have the upper hand in Syria now, Arad said. As the meeting concluded in Turkey, Macron was quoted as saying, there will be no real, sustainable, credible refugee return if the political process is not initiated. The United Nations estimates that 400,000 Syrians have died in the war began in 2011, and millions have fled the country, seeking refuge, first in neighboring Turkey and Jordan, but many pressing onto Western Europe. We don't have any illusions about Russia in the Middle East or in Europe, Arad added. He noted Moscow's stepped-up naval operations in the North Sea, its political pressure on the Baltic states, and its past behavior in backing separatists with arms and intelligence in Georgia and Ukraine. At the same time, we don't see Russia as the USSR revisited, he said. The combined defense spending of France, the United Kingdom, and Deutschland exceeds Moscow's. Russia is raising some political problems, especially with its behavior in Ukraine. But it is not the intimidating superpower of the Cold War. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Russia on October 21st, 2015, Kremlin photo. And when it comes to putting its money where its mouth is, in confronting Moscow's new aggression, Arad said, we have done the job in applying increasingly severe sanctions on Russian banks, businesses, and individuals as a member of the European Union and as a nation. Our trade is 10 times more with the United States than with Russia, so the sanctions' impact is felt far more in Europe than in America. As an example, he said, France, their impact has been particularly felt in agriculture, a sector that has been heavily engaged in trading with Russia, he said. While France is the United States' oldest continuous ally, dating to the Revolution, the relationship has not always been a smooth one. To French leaders, Washington's walking away from the Iranian nuclear agreement and willingness to impose tough sanctions on third-party nations and businesses trading with Tehran is a bit weird since we have the same diagnostics on its behavior. Arad cited Tehran's ambitious missile program, its meddling in affairs in other Middle Eastern countries, and backing of Shia extremist groups as examples of where Washington and Paris see eye to eye. But when it comes to continuing to remain in the agreement, Paris and Washington have remained far apart. Adding new tensions to that split is the looming November 4th deadline set at the administration of President Donald Trump to impose a new round of broader sanctions. The wording of the proposed ban is general and sweeping, he said, and that is extremely worrisome to Europeans, Russians, and Chinese. France, Deutschland, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and the United States signed the agreement with Iran in 2015. The European Union was also included in the pact. So far, international inspectors have found Iran abiding by the pact that halted for a decade its nuclear weapons development program, and countries like France and Deutschland have been working with Tehran to keep it in place in exchange for greater trade with their nations. Even the sale of medicines and other goods considered humanitarian assistance by France or any other country to Persia could fall under the scope of the new sanctions. Let's see if we can work together in defining what is liable and what is acceptable. France is expecting our American friends to make some moves in clarifying Washington's position. You need to be more precise, he said. Arad speaking before Merkel's announcement. She would not seek re-election in 2021, said France, as emerged as the leader in the European Union at a time when political leaders in Italy, Hungary, and Poland are questioning its value to their nations and the continent as a whole. As the European Union nations face elections this spring to its parliament, Arad said it was vital for European Union backers like France to show citizens in member nations that it is important for our country and they benefit from free trade on the continent and in their economic dealings outside Europe. As an example of its security guarantees being used, France invoked its European Union membership when terrorists launched a wave of attacks in Paris 2015. Rather than seeking assistance through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the fact is that the European Union is muddling through on migration from economically stressed regions such as the Sahel in Africa and refugees fleeing the fighting in Syria. Immigration was at the top of the list of nationalist concerns about the viability of the European Union, Arad said. We are not naive when it comes to growing Chinese economic influence globally. China is on the rise, Arad said. In relative terms, the U.S. is in decline. He called this dynamic a rebalancing and power politics that can be mitigated through international law and dialogue between the two powers. Russia is no longer the global superpower that the Soviet Union was, he said earlier. Now the major relationship is between Beijing and Washington. Some commentary by Bradford. Firstly, with Iran not being taken into these discussions, that is leaving out a very significant player and ally. Just as France came in the Battle of Yorktown and Admiral de Grasse's navy repelled the British navy that allowed the independence of the United States of America, Iran is helping the smaller Syria with substantial military aid of their many special forces officers, probably a good fifth or more of their elite troops are rotating in and out, which means everybody in the course of a couple years is going to have to do a tour in Iran from their most elite military units. And they talked about the budgets of the United Kingdom, France, and der Deutschland. The in English, France, Germany, the United Kingdom may, in nominal euros and pounds, have a larger budget than is disclosed by the Russian Federation and their allies. There's a huge difference. I calculated there's one unit a monetary equivalent is worth 20 times more in the Russian Federation and Allied budget, as they only pay, let's say, an enlisted private first class equivalent or seaman first class, airman first class, a couple $100 a month instead of a couple thousand euros a month in salary and benefits. And that would probably even include their health insurance, because young men need almost no health insurance other than vaccinations if they're going to go serve in Africa or something, because they're in the prime of their life, just out of high school. So the budget, if you take that they're roughly equivalent, and then you figure that Russia understates their spending, you want, as the Jesuit priest who wrote The Art of War, Sun Tzu, says, you want to appear weak when you are strong. I would think they would probably understate their budget, and they have a large defense industry that exports. So those factors would make probably over a 10 to 12 time force multiplier over the United Kingdom, France. And that qualitatively, the Russian military is much stronger than the European Union countries, as they have a draft. So even young men who may qualify as alternates on the Russian Olympic team in track or soccer or many other gifted students serve in the armed forces of Russia, where the best and brightest of France and the United Kingdom and Germany, and particularly in Germany, the army isn't very prestigious and is more seen as a welfare program for maybe the village bully or the bully on the block in Berlin or Frankfurt. So they don't get even average quality individuals to join the European or North American armed forces of Canada, the United States, Mexico. They get below average compared to what the private sector workforce would get, like General Electric or Siemens Corporation, International Business Machines, ExxonMobil. They don't get the quality of engineer, let's say, in the United States Air Force that ExxonMobil or Goldman Sachs Investment Bank would get in the United States. There's a really fine map, which is what attracted me to this article. So that's a little bit of informed commentary there for you. I've been a proud member of the United States Naval Institute for many years, and enjoyed their magazines. And in that as well, regarding China, China is extremely weak militarily. They have poor leadership. They're poorly equipped. They are run in Napoleon Bonaparte style, where you buy your commissions. So if your father is a Communist Party official, you can buy your way in as an officer versus getting there on merit, like you would have in France, or pretty much every country gave up the buying your commissions way to get their military officers. So, and China's military is not for deploying outside of China. China can't control their own territory. They have to incarcerate massive amounts of people, torture and execute thousands of people. There's protests every single day on a large scale that have to be violently repressed. China doesn't have enough potable water. As we get longer into the Holocene period of the post-Ice Age, the glaciers have been melting now for 14, 15,000 years, and many of the lands that are irrigated, every year, the glaciers move back some in most places. It's not everywhere, but 90% of the glaciers are melting and have been melting for 15,000 years. So, and also they have electric and internal combustion engine pumps pumping groundwater aquifers dry in China. So they're going to have a harder time. They're losing farmland every year, and their population, because of increased life expectancy, more than increase in births, is growing. And what is even worse is the consumption of the average Chinese person has been growing geometrically. So you can have a stable population, but if your consumption growing, that creates all kinds of problems. The country has polluted most of their potable water. They have a huge amount of birth defects, and the country's literally tearing itself apart. And so it is a client state to the United States. It is a slave state with sweatshop factories and labor that pollutes China so that we don't have the pollution here. I'm from Indiana, one of what used to be at one time around the Great Lakes region of the United States, the most industrialized region of the world. Fortunately, we moved our factories overseas. Our rivers and streams of Indiana, you can't drink the water here in Indiana without it being treated because it's so poisoned from industry. And we haven't had industry in decades now of any consequence. So instead of the pollution being here, those horrible factory jobs that were boring and mind-numbing, soul-sucking jobs were sent to China. People are better off making half the wages and not having all that pollution generated because the corporations here in the Great Lakes region were too powerful because we have corporatist governance system where the U.S. Chamber of Commerce runs our government, not the House of Representatives, Senate, the President. The think tanks like the Hudson Institute, for example, the Rand Corporation, the Rockefellers Foundation, through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the second most powerful lobby, the real estate lobby, they spend a couple $1 billion a year lobbying Congress. And between that and blackmail, as we don't have an agency to protect the senators, congressmen, judges, president from blackmail, or they don't do it intentionally. They leave them wide open to being blackmailed and controlled and threatened. They don't give them proper security and such. Or their electronic devices or their physical persons or their daughters and mothers and people like that are all vulnerable targets. All they do is rubber stamp. They don't even read the legislation that they're voting on. And I know this from firsthand experience, as I have been involved in writing legislation that was passed through Congress. actual word for word. It was unchanged. So, and I know that my local representatives voted yes for it without ever reading it. So I know this from personal firsthand experience, not from hearsay. Um, that's quite a bit. This was a good one. I hope you enjoyed the outstanding content. Please like and subscribe and press that bell. Thank you and have a wonderful day.